We talked briefly about process, and now we're going to discuss regarding the tool that we use in order to understand how a process works between start and finish. So we will cover the topic of process mapping, and more specifically business process mapping, and process maps, which are the outcome and deliverable from a process mapping exercise. So what is process mapping? It is the graphical representation of a process, illustrating description about how things get done between the process starts and the process ends. This includes tasks, activities, and decisions that are made within the context of a process. It helps participants in process mapping workshops in order to visualize the details of a process pretty closely. And also, it is very, very helpful in guiding decision making. For example, about improvements that we're going to make in a process. One can identify the major areas and strengths and weaknesses of a process just by creating a process map and then going step by step between the start and finish. And this is typically when we identify and we highlight areas of potential process waste that we're going to investigate in a Lean Six Sigma project. Process mapping definitely help us reduce the lead time, which is the end-to-end process time, cycle times within the process, and cycle time is how long it takes for a task, for example, to be completed. And also, it helps us identify defects, collect data, analyze the data, find root causes, creating the defects, and either eliminating the root causes or at least reducing them. So, a process map is a graphic representation, just like you can see in the figure. We have post-it notes. We can use different standardized process mapping symbols, etc. So, what is business process mapping? Well, it is a set of activities that are involved in defining what a business entity actually does, who is responsible for what within the organization, to what standard a business process should be completed in order to satisfy the needs and requirements of stakeholders, and how the success of a business process can be determined. Regarding components of process mapping, if we think about a process map, the basic components are the process start and the process end. And these capture the scope of the process. Also, we have inputs, we have outputs, and we have process actors participating in the process. Some of them, they are suppliers of inputs. Some of them are customers receiving the outputs of a process. So a good process map should illustrate the flow of work as it passes through the different stages between start and finish. Make use of a common, unified language associated with process mapping symbols that are easily understood by everyone. And finally, the process map should contain sufficient detail with respect to multiple paths in the process. Some of these paths can be parallel, decisions that are made, as well as rework loops. Regarding process mapping symbols, These are common and known as flowchart symbols, flowchart shapes, or flow diagram symbols. These come from UML, Unified Modeling Language, and this is an international standard for drawing process map that we use during the process mapping. So the process map. The process map is the outcome and the deliverable from a process mapping session. So a process is typically mapped within the context of a workshop where a number of people that have knowledge at different levels and experience about the process. This includes the process workers, like people that are subject matter experts about the process, management, like the process owner, like the champion, the sponsor of the project for which we're mapping the process, etc. And also, it graphically shows the outputs of a process in a clear, step-by-step type of capacity. So why do we need process maps? Process mapping is a tool. So it visually represents how the process works between start and finish. It provides a visual glimpse of different aspects and different business processes, provides information and helps determine who is doing what, when, where, and in some cases how, depending on the level of detail of the process mapping. And it guides towards identifying process waste, like defects, in order to eventually conduct root cause analysis, identify the root causes creating the waste, and either eliminate the root causes or at least reduce them to an acceptable levels. So there are a number of reasons that can justify the need for process maps. There is an expression that a picture is worth 1,000 words, and this is very true when it comes to process mapping. The use of graphs, charts, tables, and images guides better than a big compiled report with lots of wording, data fixation issues in it. Also, process maps facilitate improvements in the process and are a great tool in order to build a team and in order to establish process ownership from the team. Decision making becomes much faster because we identify waste, we highlight it, we identify the root causes, and then we brainstorm solutions about how to eliminate or reduce it. And finally, the improvements made in the process can easily be tracked using process maps because it becomes possible to audit and understand different process areas as well as how the process fits within the context of the organization. Visual illustration of a process for training purposes, for example, for training new joiners to a process or new joiners to the organization. It is a great way in order for people to understand how the process works. And again, the principle is a picture is worth 1,000 words. So in the need of change, when the organization moves towards making changes in a business process without understanding the current working process, it is highly likely that they're going to commit many more mistakes or deploy resources in an inefficient and ineffective way. So process map provide a detailed outlook of the current process and guide effective management of change. By the way, there are different levels of details in process mapping. So later we're going to talk about the SIPOC diagram. SIPOC is an acronym standing for suppliers of inputs in the process, high-level process steps, outputs, and the customers who receive the outputs. So this is typically what we call the equivalent of a high-level process map. But each high-level process step can be broken down into more and more detail. So we have 5 levels of detail when we're creating a process map, from 0 all the way to 5. We call these levels of detail. And a process map serves as a measurement tool for a process that is very, very important and necessary in order to properly manage the process and also improve the process. Regarding the types of process maps, usually we have 2 broad types. One is known as the process flow chart, and the other is known as deployment flow chart. Now, process flow charts illustrates where the process starts, where the process stops, and all the tasks, activities, and decisions between start and finish, but does not have any indication about who carries out each of the tasks and who makes the decisions. On the other hand, a deployment flow chart, which is also known as a swim lane map, includes all the details of a process flow chart, but also provides an indication of what we call process actors. And a process actor can be a person, can be a functional area in the business, a department. It may also be, for example, an IT system. So in a deployment flow chart, we can see who, in terms of process actor, is performing which tasks and activities. And each process actor has a dedicated swim lane. So that person is responsible for all the tasks, activities, and decisions taking place within the swim lane. A process flow chart is the simplest form of a process map, and it provides a visual representation of the sequence of activities that have to be completed in order to have a desirable result. For example, a unit of product that is ready to be handed over to the customer. Provides the basic details of the process, which can later be augmented by adding, for example, roles and responsibilities of the process actors participating in the process. This is an example of a process flow chart. As you can see, we have a particular sequence of tasks, activities, and decisions. And in some cases, when we have decision points represented by the diamond shape, we also have some rework loops. Because when we come to a decision point, for example, like meets the requirements with a question mark, then typically there are 2 possible paths. If the answer is yes, then we progress to the next process step. If the answer is no, we may have to go back to a previous step, complete it, go through the decision point again, and move to the next step in the process. This is an example of a deployment flow chart. In this case, we have the pizza place, and this is obviously a facility that produces pizzas, like a pizzeria. So on the left-hand side, we have the current state of the process before we make any changes. And on the other side, we have the improved process. So the first is the as is, and the second is the to be or should be. And you can see in the latter that we have fewer process steps, and the flow of the process has been greatly simplified. So process maps can help you identify waste in the process, and this is typically an activity taking place during the measure phase of the make project lifecycle. And also make sure that the process delivers in order to meet customer requirements and customer specifications, and also the requirements of key process stakeholders. So, how to start mapping a process? Well, process mapping is a process itself. So, we have to follow a specific sequence and complete certain tasks in order to have a complete process map that's ready to be used for identifying waste, analyzing waste, brainstorming solutions, etc. So the first one is about selecting the process. Now, not all business processes have to be mapped, and definitely not all business processes have to be mapped to the extreme level of detail. So the whole idea behind a process map is we map to the level of detail that helps us solve the business problem. So for starters, we must articulate the reason of why we need to map the process and provide a business justification for the mapping. Some examples when we can justify process mapping. A process may be underperforming and not meeting customer requirements and specifications. The process will introduce a new product or a new service. So we have to fully understand how the product or the service is going to be created and delivered to the customers. And the process owner may want to investigate and identify opportunities in order to make a process perform better. So in this step, we must determine the process start and the process end points, and this determine the scope of the process, what is included in the process and what is excluded from the process, as well as the event that is triggering the process start. For example, in many processes, the trigger for starting and running a process is a customer request for a product or a service. The scope and the level of detail of the process map, in other words, what is included and what should be excluded, must be determined and agreed between the process management team and the governance, typically the sponsor of the make project. We must create a document containing all the relevant information associated with the process that we're about to map. For example, what is the problem statement? What is the business problem that we intend to solve? What are the stakeholder requirements? These, as we'll discuss later, are known as critical to quality, and they're associated with critical process outputs. What are the business objectives associated, with the process to be mapped? And is the process to be mapped aligned with the general goals and objectives of the organization. Step number 2 is about identifying the scope of the process. So, when we refer to the term scope, this indicates what is included in the process between the process start and the process finish, and what is excluded from the process. And the scope is very important because in some projects, if we get the process scope wrong and we try to do too much, here comes the expression, if we try to boil the ocean, then most likely our project is going to fail. So we have to scope the process, and this is typically happening during the define phase of the make, and agree with the project sponsor about where to start and what to finish, and what the deliverables of the process will be. So, the elements associated with the process, for example, people, materials, equipment, suppliers, the supplies that they provide as input to the process output, etc. This must be identified, and where it is appropriate, they also must be validated. This can be accomplished using tools and techniques such as the classic brainstorming, industry standards, industry norms, and typically we use them as a reference, standard operating procedures and working instructions, and finally, what is invaluable when we create a process map is the knowledge and experience of personnel. And that's why it is very important in process mapping workshops to engage process subject matter experts. These are the equivalent of what we called Lean Six Sigma yellow belts. People that are engaging with the process on a day-to-day basis. Step number 3, we have to plan and schedule the resources. Now, when we run a process, the process consumes resources and converts process inputs into process outputs. Process inputs can be tangible, like raw materials, or they can be intangible, like information. And the same applies for the process outputs. They can be tangible, for example, a physical product, like a package of M&M, piece of chocolate treats, or intangible, for example, a decision made about a loan application submitted by a consumer. So it is very necessary that the mindset of the managers should be shifted from functional to process-oriented when we're designing the process map. And by the way, we say that there are 3 views of a process. The first one is how we think it works. The second is how it actually works. And the third is how it should work. So during process mapping, we try to capture the reality of how the process really works. So we don't try to sugarcoat parts of the process that are not functioning properly. We want to bring them to light so we can analyze them and we can make improvements in the process. So, based on the system's roles and responsibilities, etc., we have to make sure that the required resources for process mapping and for running the process will be available when we need them. And this is typically the responsibility of senior management. that have oversight of the project, like the sponsor or the champion, to make sure that the team has everything they need in order to successfully complete the project. Step number 4 is we have to select the process mapping technique. There are several techniques, several ways in order to map a process. So we have to make sure that we use the appropriate technique for the type of process map that we are creating.